March 9, 1974, Lubang Island, Philippines. A Japanese man in tattered military uniform emerges from the jungle, clutching a rifle that still works despite 3 decades of tropical humidity. He's 52 years old, but looks ancient, weathered by years of living in caves and eating coconuts and lizards. His name is Hiroo Onoda. He's a lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army, and he's been fighting World War II for 29 years after it ended. He refused to believe Japan surrendered, dismissed every attempt to inform him as enemy propaganda, continued his guerrilla campaign against phantom enemies long after everyone else went home. Standing before him is Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's former commanding officer, now 64 years old and flown from Japan specifically for this moment. Taniguchi is in civilian clothes, looks nothing like the officer Onoda remembers from 1945, but he carries documents proving his identity. He reads the official order, his voice shaking with emotion. "Lieutenant Onoda, you are hereby ordered to cease all military operations and place yourself under my command." The words hang in the humid air. Onoda salutes, tears streaming down his face. Finally accepts that the war is over, that he's been fighting ghosts for 3 decades. This is not a story about confusion or misunderstanding, not a tale of a simple soldier who missed the memo about surrender. Hiroo Onoda was intelligence officer specifically trained for long-term guerrilla warfare, instructed never to surrender, ordered to continue fighting until relieved by his superiors regardless of how long that took. He took those orders literally, maintained his mission for 29 years, killed approximately 30 Filipinos during that time, refused to surrender to anyone except his direct commanding officer. His story is about duty taken to absolute extreme, about loyalty beyond reason, about how training and ideology can override reality itself. Hiroo Onoda is born March 19, 1922, in Wakayama Prefecture, Japan. His family is middle class. His father works in education. Young Hiroo grows up during Japan's increasingly militaristic period when the country is expanding its empire across Asia. He attends school during the 1930s when Japanese education emphasizes loyalty to the emperor, military values, the destiny of Japan to lead Asia. These ideas shape him profoundly. He grows up believing that serving the emperor is the highest possible calling, that death is preferable to surrender. At age 17, Hiroo goes to work for a trading company in China. This gives him experience with Chinese language and culture, exposes him to Japan's colonial administration in occupied territories. But his career in commerce is cut short when he's drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1942. At age 20, sent to infantry training, and then selected for special training as intelligence officer. His selection is based on his intelligence, his language skills, his demonstrated loyalty to Japan and to the emperor. In 1944, as the war turns decisively against Japan, Onoda is sent to Nakano School, the Imperial Japanese Army's intelligence academy where special warfare techniques are taught. Nakano School trains officers in espionage, sabotage, guerrilla warfare, psychological operations, the skills needed for unconventional warfare. The training is harsh, designed to produce officers who can operate independently behind enemy lines for extended periods. The instructors emphasize that officers must never surrender, must continue fighting until relieved by proper authority, must maintain their mission regardless of circumstances. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi is one of Onoda's instructors at Nakano School. He teaches guerrilla warfare techniques, emphasizes the importance of maintaining discipline and mission focus, even when isolated from higher command. Taniguchi tells his students that surrender is unacceptable, that they must continue fighting even if it seems the war is lost, that their duty to the emperor transcends personal survival. These lessons sink deep into Onoda's mind, become the core principles that will guide him for the next 3 decades. In December 1944, Lieutenant Onoda receives his orders. He's being sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His mission is to conduct guerrilla operations against American forces, to destroy the airstrip and the port facilities, to disrupt American supply lines. He's told to do everything possible to delay American advance, to make them pay for every inch of ground. Most importantly, he's ordered never to surrender, never to take his own life, to continue the mission until properly relieved by superior officers. The orders are explicit and absolute. Lubang Island is small, about 12 miles long and 8 miles wide, mostly jungle-covered mountains with a few small fishing villages along the coast. The island has strategic value only because of its location near the entrance to Manila Bay. Controlling it provides some tactical advantage for naval operations. By late 1944, American forces are advancing through the Philippines, recapturing territory from Japanese occupation. The battle is already largely lost, but Japanese forces are ordered to resist to the bitter end. Onoda arrives on Lubang in late December 1944 with orders to lead guerrilla operations. He finds a small Japanese garrison already on the island, about 50 soldiers commanded by officers who outrank him. The senior officers don't take Onoda's guerrilla mission seriously. They're planning conventional defense. They ignore his suggestions about destroying the airstrip and port. This frustrates Onoda, but he's junior officer. He has to defer to their authority. He prepares for guerrilla operations, while the garrison prepares for conventional battle they cannot win. American and Filipino forces land on Lubang in February 1945. They quickly overwhelm the small Japanese garrison, kill or capture most of the defenders within days. Onoda and a handful of other soldiers escape into the jungle, begin the guerrilla campaign that Onoda was sent to conduct. Initially, there are about 10 men operating together, conducting small raids, avoiding American patrols, living off the land. They believe they're part of larger Japanese strategy, that reinforcements will come, that they're contributing to the war effort by tying down American forces. But the months pass. No reinforcements arrive. American forces capture more and more Philippine territory. By August 1945, the war ends with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Leaflets are dropped on Lubang, announcing the war's end, urging Japanese holdouts to surrender, promising fair treatment. Onoda and his men find the leaflets, read them carefully, discuss them at length. They conclude the leaflets are American propaganda, psychological warfare designed to trick them into surrendering. They remember their training that said never trust enemy information. Continue the mission until properly relieved. More efforts follow to convince the holdouts to surrender. Loudspeakers broadcast surrender messages. Letters from family members are dropped. Newspapers showing Japan's surrender are left in locations the holdouts might find them. Each effort is dismissed as increasingly sophisticated propaganda. Onoda is convinced that Japan would never surrender, that the emperor would never accept defeat. Therefore, any evidence suggesting surrender must be fabricated by clever enemy psychological operations. His Nakano school training has prepared him too well to resist such tactics. The group of holdouts gradually shrinks through attrition. Some are killed in skirmishes with Filipino police. Some surrender when they decide the evidence of war's end is genuine. By 1950, only 4 men remain: Onoda and 3 others, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, and Private Yuchi Akatsu. They constitute themselves as a cell, continue operations, raid Filipino farms for food and supplies, occasionally exchange fire with police, maintain military discipline and routine, even as years pass with no contact from Japanese command. Private Akatsu separates from the group in 1950 He's tired of the hardship, doubts the mission, wanders away, and eventually surrenders to Filipino authorities 6 months later. He's returned to Japan, where he tells authorities that Onoda and the others are still on Lubang, still fighting, still refusing to believe the war is over. This creates international attention. Japanese and Philippine governments organize new efforts to convince the holdouts to surrender. Onoda's brother travels to Lubang and broadcasts appeals. Photographs of post-war Japan are distributed, but nothing works. Onoda and the remaining 2 men, Shimada and Kozuka, continue their guerrilla campaign through the 1950s and into the 1960s. They develop sophisticated techniques for avoiding capture. They know every trail and cave on the island. They move constantly, maintain strict operational security. They conduct reconnaissance before every raid. They're professional soldiers who refuse to quit. The decades blur together. They mark time by the seasons, by the age of their equipment that slowly deteriorates despite careful maintenance, by the gray appearing in their hair dot. In 1952, letters and family photographs are dropped specifically addressed to the 3 holdouts. The documents include personal information that only genuine family members would know. This is strong evidence that the materials are genuine. But Onoda analyzes the documents and concludes they might be forgeries, created by Japanese prisoners forced to provide personal information. His logical framework has no room for accepting surrender. Every piece of evidence gets reinterpreted to fit his belief that the war continues. This is confirmation bias taken to pathological extreme. But from Onoda's perspective, he's being appropriately skeptical of enemy. Psychological operations. The raids continue sporadically. Onoda and his men steal food from farms, take supplies they need, occasionally burn rice stores they believe might supply enemy forces. These actions kill or injure Filipino civilians and police officers over the years. From the Filipinos' perspective, these Japanese holdouts are dangerous bandits who should be hunted down and killed. From Onoda's perspective, they're conducting legitimate military operations against enemy forces occupying Japanese-controlled territory. The disconnect is complete and tragic. In 1954, Corporal Shimada is shot and killed during a skirmish with a search party. Now only Onoda and Kozuka remain, 2 men continuing a war that ended 9 years earlier. They bury Shimada with military honors, maintain their discipline and routine, continue the mission because they know nothing else. The years continue passing. The 1950s become the 1960s. They're no longer young men. They're middle-aged. Their bodies wear down from decades of inadequate nutrition and tropical diseases and the constant stress of evading capture. In 1965, another major search operation is organized, this time with genuine urgency because a Filipino farmer is killed during a raid. Onoda and Kozuka are now considered dangerous fugitives, not curious remnants of a past war. The search involves hundreds of Filipino soldiers and police. They comb the island systematically. They find campsites and supply caches, but never catch the 2 holdouts, who are too skilled at evasion after 20 years of practice. The search eventually ends without success. The authorities conclude that the holdouts might be dead, that maybe the problem has solved itself through natural attrition. But Onoda and Kozuka are very much alive. They continue their routine through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. They're now in their late 40s, have spent more years on Lubang fighting phantom war than they spent in their previous civilian lives. This has become their normal. They remember Japan before the war only dimly, like a dream from someone else's life. Their equipment is falling apart. Their rifles are held together with improvised repairs. Their uniforms are patched remnants, but their discipline remains iron hard. Their dedication to duty unchanged. On October 19, 1972, Kozuka is killed during a raid on a rice field. Shot by Filipino police, he dies instantly at age 51, having spent 27 years fighting a war that ended before he turned 30. Onoda is now alone, the last holdout on Lubang. He's 50 years old, has been on the island for 28 years, has no companions to share the burden, faces the remaining years in complete solitude. He buries Kozuka with full military honors, says prayers for his comrade's spirit, then continues the mission alone because the orders never specified that he could quit if everyone else was gone. Kozuka's death creates renewed international attention. Japanese and Philippine media cover the story extensively. The fact that Japanese soldiers are still fighting nearly 3 decades after the war seems almost unbelievable. Efforts to contact Onoda intensify. The Japanese government is embarrassed by the situation, wants to resolve it peacefully. The Philippine government wants to end the threat to their citizens. But Onoda remains elusive and unconvinced by any outreach attempts. In February 1974, a young Japanese man named Norio Suzuki travels to the Philippines specifically to find Onoda. Suzuki is an adventurer and idealist who wants to do something meaningful. He's heard about Onoda and decides to attempt what governments and military operations have failed to accomplish. He goes to Lubang and hikes into the jungle without weapons or official support. Just camping equipment and a camera, he leaves notes at locations he thinks Onoda might visit, announcing his presence and his desire to talk. Remarkably, this approach works. Onoda finds one of Suzuki's notes, is intrigued by the informal approach, decides to make contact to determine if this is genuine Japanese civilian or another trick. Suzuki and Onoda meet in the jungle on February 20, 1974. They talk for several days. Suzuki explains that the war ended decades ago, shows photographs of modern Japan, explains the economic miracle that transformed Japan from defeated nation to economic powerhouse. Onoda listens but remains skeptical. He's heard similar claims before. Suzuki asks what it would take for Onoda to believe the war is over and to surrender. Onoda's answer is simple and absolute. He will surrender only to his direct commanding officer, Major Taniguchi, who must come to Lubang and give him direct orders to cease operations and return to Japan. No one else has the authority. No amount of evidence will suffice. Only proper military chain of command can end his mission. This is the key that everyone missed for 29 years. Onoda isn't confused about whether the war ended. He simply won't accept that information from anyone except his designated superior. Suzuki returns to Japan with this information, convinces the Japanese government to locate Major Taniguchi, who is now 64 years old and working as a bookseller. Had no idea his former student was still fighting on Lubang. Taniguchi initially doesn't want to go, feels terrible about the role his training played in creating this situation, but eventually agrees that he has moral obligation to end what he started. The Philippine and Japanese governments organize the mission. Taniguchi flies to Manila and then to Lubang, prepares to meet his former student after 29 years. On March 9, 1974, the meeting occurs in the jungle. Suzuki has arranged the location. Taniguchi arrives in civilian clothes carrying documents proving his identity. Onoda emerges from the jungle in his tattered uniform, salutes his former commander, waits for orders. Taniguchi formally reads the orders, relieving Onoda of his duties, ordering him to cease all combat operations, ordering him to surrender to Philippine authorities. Onoda salutes, acknowledges the orders, asks if he's allowed to keep his sword as personal possession. Taniguchi agrees. Onoda formally surrenders to Philippine authorities who are present, hands over his rifle, which still functions despite 29 years of tropical conditions. The surrender ceremony is formal and dignified. Onoda presents his rifle, his sword, his hand grenades, his ammunition. all meticulously maintained despite the years. He provides intelligence reports. He's kept documenting his observations of the island. He conducts himself as professional officer reporting to command after extended mission. The Philippine officers receiving his surrender treat him with respect. They understand they're witnessing something historically unique. The end of World War II, finally coming to its absolute conclusion 3 decades late. Onoda is taken to Manila, where he's processed by both Philippine and Japanese authorities. Medical examinations reveal he's remarkably healthy for someone who spent 29 years living in jungle, eating lizards and coconuts and stolen rice. His teeth are in terrible shape, and he has various tropical diseases, but overall his condition is surprisingly good. Psychological evaluations find him rational and mentally sound. He's not insane or delusional. He simply followed his orders to their logical extreme and maintained his discipline for 3 decades. The legal situation is complicated. Onoda killed approximately 30 Filipino civilians during his holdout. Technically, these are crimes under Philippine law. He could be prosecuted for murder. But President Ferdinand Marcos pardons Onoda, recognizing that Onoda believed he was conducting legitimate military operations under wartime orders. That prosecuting a man for following orders he received 29 years earlier serves no useful purpose. The pardon is controversial among Filipinos who lost family members to Onoda's raids. But Marcos prioritizes good relations with Japan over pursuing justice for decades-old deaths. Onoda returns to Japan as a celebrity. Thousands greet him at the airport. Media coverage is intense. He's simultaneously war hero who exemplified loyalty and duty. An embarrassing reminder of Japan's militaristic past that most Japanese prefer to forget. Some Japanese admire his dedication and discipline. Others think he's a fool who wasted 3 decades fighting a war that ended before he turned 30. The reactions reveal Japan's complicated relationship with its World War II history. But Onoda struggles to adjust to modern Japan. The country he left in 1944 no longer exists. Everything has changed. The values he fought for have been abandoned. Japan is now a peaceful democracy allied with America. The emperor is constitutional figurehead, not divine ruler. The military culture that shaped Onoda has been dismantled. He feels like stranger in his own country, can't relate to modern Japanese who care about economic success and consumer goods. Not about duty and sacrifice and loyalty to Emperor Dot in 1975. Onoda publishes a memoir titled No Surrender, My 30-Year War. The book becomes international bestseller. Tells his story in his own words, explains his reasoning for refusing to believe the war ended, describes his daily life during the decades on Lubang. The book reveals a complex man, not simple fanatic, but someone who took his duty seriously and maintained his standards regardless of circumstances. Readers are fascinated by his mindset and by his survival skills. Unable to settle into normal life in Japan, Onoda emigrates to Brazil in 1975, buys a cattle ranch in Mato Grosso do Sul, lives quietly raising cattle and avoiding publicity. Brazil's frontier culture appeals to him more than modern Japan. The self-reliance required for ranching matches his skills and temperament better than Japanese corporate culture. He marries a Japanese woman he meets in Brazil. They live together on the ranch. He finds some peace in the simple life, far from the controversies and attention in Japan. But Onoda eventually returns to Japan in 1984, establishes a nature camp for young people called the Onoda Nature School, teaches survival skills and traditional values to Japanese youth who he thinks have become too soft and materialistic. He wants to pass on the discipline and self-reliance he learned during his years in the jungle, wants to help young Japanese develop character through exposure to nature and hardship. The school operates for many years. Onoda is popular with students who admire his toughness and his stories. Throughout his later life, Onoda never apologizes for the Filipinos killed during his holdout, maintains that he was following orders and conducting legitimate military operations. He expresses regret that people died but doesn't accept moral responsibility for their deaths because he believed he was at war. This lack of remorse troubles many people, particularly Filipinos, who see Onoda as unrepentant killer. But from Onoda's perspective, apologizing would dishonor his duty and the orders he followed for 29 years. In 1996, Onoda returns to Lubang Island for the first time since his surrender. He meets with Filipino survivors of his raids, visits the graves of people killed during his holdout. The visit is emotional and complicated. Some Filipinos welcome him and praise his dedication to duty. Others condemn him as murderer who never faced justice. Onoda maintains his dignity throughout, acknowledges the tragedy, but doesn't apologize. The visit achieves some reconciliation, but doesn't fully heal the wounds. Onoda continues living between Japan and Brazil, maintains his nature school, occasionally gives interviews and speeches, becomes elder statesman representing values that have largely disappeared from modern Japan. He's a controversial figure who some admire and others condemn, but everyone agrees his story is remarkable, his dedication extraordinary, even if his judgment was catastrophically wrong. He represents both the best and worst of traditional Japanese military culture, the loyalty and discipline that could inspire amazing endurance, but also the rigid ideology that couldn't adapt to new realities. Hiroo Onoda dies January 16, 2014, at age 91, from heart failure at a Tokyo hospital. His death receives international coverage. Obituaries appear in major newspapers worldwide. His story fascinates people decades after the events because it reveals so much about loyalty and duty and ideology and how training can override reality. His funeral is attended by hundreds, including former comrades, Japanese officials, and admirers from around the world. He's buried with military honors, his life celebrated despite the controversies. The questions Onoda's story raises remain difficult. Was he hero or fool? Was his loyalty admirable or pathological? Should he have been prosecuted for the deaths he caused, or was the pardon appropriate, given his belief that he was following orders? Different people answer these questions differently, based on their values and perspectives. There are no simple answers, because Onoda's situation was unprecedented and extreme. From one perspective, Onoda exemplifies ultimate loyalty and dedication to duty. He was given orders, and he followed them regardless of personal cost. For 29 years he maintained military discipline and continued his mission, despite isolation and hardship and every incentive to quit. This level of dedication is rare and arguably admirable, even if the cause was lost. His survival skills were extraordinary, living for decades in jungle with minimal equipment, while evading capture required intelligence and physical toughness and practical skills that few people possess. From another perspective, Onoda was tragically misguided. His refusal to accept evidence that the war ended was irrational stubbornness, not admirable loyalty. He killed innocent Filipinos for no purpose years after any military justification ended. He wasted 3 decades of his life fighting phantom enemies when he could have been living normal, productive life. His training at Nakano School was so effective that it disabled his judgment, made him unable to adapt to changed circumstances. His loyalty to orders became pathological obsession that caused unnecessary suffering. The role of Onoda's training and orders in creating this situation raises questions about military training generally. The military trains soldiers to follow orders without question, to maintain discipline under extreme conditions, to never surrender. These qualities are necessary for military effectiveness, but can lead to situations like Onoda's, where literal obedience to orders produces absurd results. The officers who trained Onoda and gave him his orders probably never imagined he would take them so literally for so long. But their instructions were clear, and Onoda followed them exactly as given. Major Taniguchi, who gave Onoda his original orders, and who finally relieved him in 1974, lived with guilt about his role in creating the situation, felt responsible for the decades Onoda spent in jungle and for the deaths Onoda caused. Taniguchi died in 1977, never fully reconciling himself to the consequences of training soldiers to never surrender. The Nakano School's training methods were arguably too effective. Created officers so dedicated to duty that they couldn't recognize when continuing their mission became counterproductive. The psychological aspects of Onoda's holdout fascinate researchers. How did he maintain his belief that the war continued despite overwhelming evidence otherwise? The answer involves confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance reduction, and the psychological need to justify decades of sacrifice by maintaining the mission that justified those sacrifices. If Onoda had admitted in 1950 or 1960 that the war ended years earlier, he would have had to accept that the previous years of hardship and the deaths he caused were meaningless. This would be psychologically unbearable. So he maintained his belief structure even when evidence contradicted it. The fact that Onoda wasn't insane or delusional makes his story more disturbing, not less. He was a rational person who followed logical chain of reasoning from false premises. His Nakano School training taught him that enemy psychological warfare would be sophisticated and convincing. Therefore, the more convincing the evidence that the war ended, the more likely it was sophisticated propaganda. This logical framework had no exit condition. Nothing could convince him except proper authority giving proper orders. Until Taniguchi appeared in 1974, Onoda had no way to accept evidence that contradicted his core beliefs. A comparison between Onoda and other Japanese holdouts is instructive. Dozens of Japanese soldiers hid on various Pacific islands after the war ended. Some surrendered within months or years when they accepted evidence that the war ended. Others, like Onoda, refused to surrender for decades. The difference seems to be how seriously they took their orders and how thoroughly they'd been trained to resist psychological warfare. Onoda's Nakano School training made him more resistant to accepting evidence of surrender than soldiers with conventional training. The most famous other holdout was Teruo Nakamura, who surrendered in 1974 on Morotai Island in Indonesia. He'd been hiding for 29 years like Onoda, but unlike Onoda, he wasn't maintaining military operations. He'd essentially gone native, built a house, farmed vegetables, avoided contact with people, but wasn't conducting guerrilla warfare. Nakamura's surrender received less attention than Onoda's because his story lacked the dramatic military discipline that made Onoda's holdout remarkable. Impact of Onoda's story on Japanese culture has been significant. He became symbol of traditional values that many Japanese feel have been lost in modern society. His discipline and loyalty represent ideals that older generations admire, even if younger Japanese find them incomprehensible or troubling. Conservative Japanese politicians sometimes cite Onoda as example of proper Japanese spirit, while progressives see him as cautionary tale about blind obedience to authority and inability to question orders even when they're obviously obsolete. The nature school Onoda established represents his attempt to pass on survival skills and traditional values to younger generation. But the school's philosophy is controversial because it emphasizes hardship and discipline that seem out of step with modern educational approaches. Some parents send children to the school specifically because they want them exposed to traditional values and challenges. Others criticize the school as promoting militaristic attitudes that should have been abandoned after World War II. The question of whether Onoda should have been prosecuted for the deaths he caused during his holdout remains debated. President Marcos's pardon was a pragmatic decision, prioritizing diplomatic relations over justice. But Filipino families who lost members to Onoda's raids never received justice or compensation. From legal perspective, arguing that someone shouldn't be prosecuted because they believed they were at war sets troubling precedent. But prosecuting someone for following orders given 29 years earlier also raises difficult questions about culpability and mental state. The survival skills Onoda demonstrated during 29 years on Lubang are genuinely impressive regardless of the larger moral questions. He maintained his physical health despite inadequate nutrition, avoided serious tropical diseases that should have killed him, kept his equipment functional despite lack of replacement parts, evaded capture by hundreds of searchers who knew the island better than him. Military survival instructors study Onoda's techniques. His memoir provides detailed information about living off the land in tropical environment. His practical knowledge has value independent of the moral questions about his holdout. The role of ideology in sustaining Onoda's holdout is crucial. He wasn't fighting for personal benefit or because he enjoyed the lifestyle. He continued because his belief in duty to Emperor and to Japan made quitting unthinkable. This ideological commitment sustained him through decades of hardship that would have broken most people. The power of ideology to shape behavior and override self-preservation instincts is demonstrated dramatically by Onoda's story. Similar examples appear throughout history when people maintain commitments to causes or beliefs despite rational self-interest suggesting they should quit. The relationship between Onoda and Suzuki, who found him in 1974, is interesting footnote. Suzuki was an idealistic adventurer who wanted to do something meaningful. Finding Onoda gave him purpose and fame. But Suzuki died just 18 months later in an avalanche while climbing in the Himalayas at age 25. Suzuki's brief life touched history through his connection to Onoda, but he died before experiencing whatever lessons that encounter might have taught him about the costs of extreme commitment to causes. The modern relevance of Onoda's story extends beyond historical curiosity. His experience raises questions about loyalty and duty that remain current, about when following orders becomes wrong, about how to maintain moral judgment while operating under authority, about the dangers of ideology that brooks no questioning. Military organizations struggle with these questions constantly, trying to train soldiers to follow orders while also developing judgment about when orders should be questioned. Onoda's story illustrates what happens when the first imperative completely overrides the second. The Filipino perspective on Onoda has softened somewhat over decades. Initial anger and desire for justice have given way to more nuanced views recognizing tragedy affected everyone, that Onoda was in some ways victim of ideology and training that destroyed his life as thoroughly as the holdout destroyed Filipino victims' lives. Some Filipinos who met Onoda during his 1996 return visit reported feeling unexpected sympathy despite their losses, recognizing him as an old man whose dedication to duty caused terrible suffering, including his own. Remember Hiroo Onoda not as simple hero or villain, but as complex figure, whose story reveals disturbing truths about duty and loyalty and ideology. His dedication to orders received in 1944 was admirable in abstract sense, but catastrophic in practice. His inability to adapt to new realities after 1945 wasted 3 decades and caused numerous deaths. His example is simultaneously inspiring and cautionary, demonstrating both human capacity for endurance and the dangers of belief systems that prevent rational adjustment to changed circumstances. Remember that Onoda wasn't insane, wasn't confused, wasn't ignorant. He was an intelligent, rational person operating from premises that seemed correct to him based on his training and orders. This makes his story more disturbing because it suggests that normal people with proper training and ideology can behave in ways that seem obviously wrong to outside observers. The implications for understanding ideology and obedience are profound and troubling. Remember the 30 Filipinos killed during Onoda's holdout, victims of war that ended before they died, families destroyed by conflicts they had no part in. The human cost of Onoda's dedication was borne primarily by innocent people who had nothing to do with World War II or with Japanese military ideology. These victims deserve remembrance, even as we try to understand Onoda's perspective and motivations. Remember that Onoda spent 29 years in jungle fighting Phantom War, wasted decades of life that could have been spent with family and productive work and normal human connections. His dedication cost him most of his adult life, left him unable to adjust to modern society, made him perpetual outsider in the country he sacrificed so much to serve. The personal cost of his loyalty was as devastating as the cost to his victims. This is Hiroo Onoda, born 1922, died 2014. Japanese intelligence officer who fought World War II until 1974, loyal soldier who killed 30 people decades after war ended, survivor who spent 29 years in jungle following orders no longer relevant, man whose dedication to duty became tragedy affecting everyone involved. His story has no simple moral, offers no comfortable lessons, just demonstrates that human capacity for commitment can be simultaneously noble and terrible, that loyalty without judgment can produce dedication that inspires and destroys in equal measure.